This video is going to be a step-by-step process of how to rebuild your KYB open chamber forks. Stay tuned. What's up guys, Greg Hitchcock here. The reason why you are probably watching this video is so you can learn how to rebuild your KYB open chamber forks without having to pay someone to do it. This video, I'm gonna be taking you through that step-by-step process. In the video, I'll explain how to get this job done without any special tools. Now, this is not the recommended way of going about doing things. I highly suggest you use the special tools, but if you are in a pinch, you can get the job done without them. Now, KYB open chamber forks, there's a ton of models that fit this style forks. But if you're not sure and your fork looks like this and has this fork cap and is a two-piece construction, this video is gonna be for you. So this rebuild is going to be for a 1999 KX250 in specific. We're going to be rebuilding with Pro X fork seals and dust seals as well as their fork bushing kit. Now, if you're not going to be rebuilding with probably the best seals out there, the SKF seals, Pro X makes a great quality OEM replacement. Highly recommend these, and if you're interested, I've linked these in my description below as well as all the tools that we're going to be using today. I'm going to set the fork up in the vise here. Now I do have soft jaws on it, but I do like to just use a microfiber towel as well. And we'll set that fork in there. Too much pressure could actually crunch the outer tube, so you just want it nice and snug. What you'll first do is take out that air bleeder screw. Just release any air that may be in the forks. You can either put that screw to the side or replace it when you're done so you don't lose it. Move over to the compression and rebound clickers. You want to turn them counterclockwise to their softest setting all the way out. Then with a 19 mil socket, go ahead and unscrew that top cap. Grab that fork out of the vise and go ahead and slide that outer tube all the way down. Then grab a 19 mil socket and pull that spring down a little bit while holding that collar up. Slip that socket into that lock nut, and then you can go ahead and blast off that top cap. And what I'm doing, I'm kind of just pushing down on the spring just a little bit. So the top cap comes off, and then you have the collar here. And then go ahead and pull that spring out of there, pull the rebound rod out of the damping rod. Then drain that oil. This oil actually looks really good. Doesn't look too good on the bottom. Pump that fork about 10 times or so to make sure all of that oil drains out. And then you can do the same with the damping rod on the inside. Then go ahead and remove the lock nut here. You may need to throw the 19 on there to just break it free a little bit, but that thing should just spin right off. Then you have the spring guide. Then go ahead and pull that damping rod out because then there is an O-ring right here that you'll need to take off. Next up, we got the removal of the cylinder valve assembly here. You're gonna need a 14mm Allen. Normally you do need a special tool to hold the damper rod here. So the special tool is supposed to slide down the fork tube and clamp into the slots here into the cartridge. Now, Motion Pro makes a tool. I bought the tool from Amazon, tried to fit it on here, and it doesn't get over this part of the cartridge. So for whatever reason, that tool does not work for these forks. So what I did was grab a 1 1/4 inch curtain rod. I'll leave the link in my description below. And when I slide the curtain rod over the cartridge, you can see that it fits perfectly. Now we just need to cut out fingers in this rod that go into the slots. All right, so in terms of making the homemade fork cartridge holding tool, I've already had the luxury of having the fork apart so I could roughly eyeball it and mark out the gaps that I needed to cut out in order to have the prongs stick into the slots of the cartridge. Now, I realized that you guys aren't going to have that luxury because the cartridge is still going to be in the fork. You're not going to be able to have it off the fork to do the same thing that I just did. But I went ahead and just made out measurements for you guys. Now, it looks pretty crazy. I drew out a circle and there's slots where you cut and slots where you don't cut. So you're going to measure point to point on the rod, which is here, point to point, and the distance right here to here is 5/8. So if I take the ruler and measuring point to point right there, you can kind of see where I cut. That's roughly 5/8. Then you need to measure for the prong, which is a distance of 5/16 inches. So if I take my ruler, you can see that's roughly 5/16. So make another mark on your curtain rod, and you're not going to cut that gap. Then what you want to do is measure out another 5/8 point to point on the curtain rod, and that's going to be a slot that you cut out, and so forth. Now this is going to get you ballpark, guys. It's not going to be 100% accurate. I mean, look at this thing. It's not perfect. I'm sure you guys can do a way better job than I did, but I can confirm 100% that this tool does work. And if you slide it down into the fork, and if you're rotating this thing and this doesn't seem to be going into the cartridge, then hey, then you can take it out and cut it a little bit. But if you guys go to make the tool yourselves, leave a comment below because I want to know if it worked out for you guys as well. But here is the math to prove it. Circumference equals pi d. I go through the whole process to get the rough prong length, which is 5/16 to roughly 3/8 inches based on the cuts that you need to make of 5/8. So give it a rip and let me know. But if you don't have the time to make this cartridge holding tool right now, you can use an impact gun to blast off that bottom base valve, but you will need this homemade tool to torque that base valve back down when you go to put the fork back together. I highly recommend you do not use the impact gun then. So either way, I suggest you make this tool. And then that bottom cartridge valve should just be able to screw right out. Then with a flathead screwdriver, you can kind of pry down that dust seal, slide it down, and then with a pick out the stop ring, and then from there you'll just be able to yank these tubes right apart. Then to remove, you got the guide bushing, the washer, the oil seal itself, and then you have the slider bushing. So now that the fork is completely disassembled, go through with some Maxima suspension clean. Clean the outside and inside of the tubes to make sure there's no dirt on the inside of those. You can spray the compression valve down with the suspension clean as well. Make sure there are 0 dirt particles when you go to put these things back together. So again, you want to make sure there's absolutely nothing on the insides of the inner or outer fork tubes here. Even the suspension clean, you want to make sure it's dry and ready to go because that will contaminate the oil on the inside of the fork. Then what you want to do is inspect this bottom tube for any nicks or burrs, which could potentially be the reason why your fork seals might have been leaking, if that was the reason why you're completely rebuilding your forks in the first place. If you do find a nick or burr anywhere, what you can do is take a 600 grit sandpaper, wet sandpaper. You'll use some suspension clean, spray the fork tube where that burr might be. Then you want to use the sandpaper, rub it horizontally in the spot where that burr is. You don't want to go vertical either, you just want to go horizontal because you could take off the coating on the lower fork here, which has lubricating properties for the operation of the suspension. Then once you're done removing the burr, take the suspension clean again, wipe the fork down, make sure everything is good to go for the reassembly. When you inspect the guide bushings, you're really looking at this nylon part here, making sure there are no burrs. Again, making sure it's really smooth. If a guide bushing is worn, this nylon will be worn through. You see how it's got the copper on the inside here. It's actually good to replace this bushing as well because the copper wear, it decreases the thickness of the overall bushing, which can have effect on the suspension performance. And again, on this other guide bushing as well, you want to make sure, you want to check the inside where the nylon is, and you do see it's got some wear on the outer copper part here. So if you got the forks apart anyway, you might as well go ahead and spend the extra few bucks on the bushing kit here. So speaking of the bushing kit, you got the inner and outer bushings here. Since this is for a bunch of different models, you're not going to use everything. You've got the retaining clips that you will use. And then here on the compression valve assembly, you've actually got the copper O-ring that you can change out, as well as this big O-ring here, which that fits there, and then the smaller O-ring on the piston, which this guy will go right on there. So time to start putting everything back together, but what we're first going to do is cut the bag on the dust and fork seal here. So this is the dust seal. The dust seal has a bigger lip on it, and the oil seal does not have a lip. So we're going to save the bag for a later trick, but now what we're going to do is throw the fork seals and the bushings into the bowl. We got some Maxima fork fluid. You always want to use a high quality fork fluid like Maxima here, and you're just going to soak those things in the fluid so they're nice and lubricated when you go to slide them on to the lower tube. I also went ahead and got suspension specific soft jaws for the vise here. So what we're going to do is just throw the lower tube into the spot here. Now the aluminum on the soft jaws won't affect the metal on the fork tube. Before you go ahead and throw the seals on, there are sharp lips on the fork tube here that if you were to just put the seal onto the fork, the sharp edge could potentially nick the seal, causing the seal to leak, which would negate the whole process that we're doing. So these fork seal bullets here are about a few bucks from Rocky Mountain ATV MC. They go over the fork tube and you can oil them up. Slide over the fork seals just fine. If you don't want to spend the few dollars on the fork seal bullet, the bag that the Pro X seals came in works perfectly. So just oil up the Pro X bag, and then you're able to oil up the dust seal first and slide that down the tube to get it over the sharp edges here so it doesn't nick the seals and you won't have a leak when you put the forks together. So I'm going to use the bullet. A couple other ways you can do it is use some packing tape around the edges here or some electrical tape, but your best bet is going to be the fork seal bullet. So I've got the Maximal oil and I've lubed up the fork here and the bullet. The dust seal is going to go on first. The closed side of the seal is going to face down. The metal ring is going to go down first, just like that. That probably works the best. Then you got the new retaining clip. Then you've got the oil seal. The open side is going to face up. The closed side is going to face down. So you've got the metal ring here that is going to face down. This one's going to be a little tighter. And then you've got this collar. There's a curved side and the edge side. The flat edge side is going to go face up towards the fork tube. Then you can go ahead and take the fork bullet off. Next up is the guide bushing. So that is going to slide right over the fork like that. And then the slider bushing is the thicker one. You kind of have to open it up to get it around the fork a little bit, and that is going to go into the slot here at the top of the fork, and you will hear that snap in. Next, we're going to slide the outer tube onto the inner tube with the bushings and seals. I also like to lubricate the inside of the outer tube with oil as well. Okay, so I got the lower tube positioned into the vise. We can then install the inner tube. So that guide bushing is going to go first, followed by the backup ring. And now I do have a fork seal driver here specifically for the 46mm fork. If you guys don't want to spend the money on the driver to get it done properly, you can actually use electrical tape. I've created another how-to video on how to do that. I'll leave it linked in my description below. And I would go ahead and drive the backup ring and guide bushing into the fork. Slide that oil seal into the fork as well. Make sure it seats nice and even. So the fork seal driver hits on the outer part of the oil seal, not the part of the seal that slides up and down on the inner fork tube. The free method actually hits up against the lip of the seal here that slides up and down the fork, not this outer lip. So that's why the fork seal driver is beneficial. Again, make sure the fork tube is nice and lubricated as well as the fork seal driver. Put the fork seal driver onto the fork tube and you'll go ahead and drive that seal in until it seats. You don't want to go ham, you just want to make sure you slide it on there enough to expose the slot for the retaining clip. You can also use the seal driver to get that in as well. We just want to make sure that clip is seated all around the entire fork there. Then you can go ahead and bring that dust seal down and you should be able to just push it in with your fingers. So now that we've got the cartridge tool holder made, we can move on. Oil up the little O-ring here on the push rod and slide that down, and that'll go right there. If you haven't already, go ahead and replace the washer and the two O-rings here on this compression base valve. Don't forget to oil them up with fresh fork oil. And go ahead and get that fork installed back into the vise. Slide that inner cartridge back into the fork, making sure that inner cartridge comes right all the way to the bottom so you can see the threads. And it's recommended that you put a little medium strength Loctite on the threads of the compression valve here, making sure that the Loctite does not come in contact with either of the O-rings. Then you can slide your fork cartridge holder back down into the fork, making sure the claws are in the slots of the cartridge. Then you can put your screwdriver in so you can hold it better. Then you can go ahead and slide the base valve into the bottom of the fork and start getting it screwed on. Then flipping the fork lug over and holding it in the vise, get it torqued down to 40 foot-pounds. And there it is, the homemade cartridge holding tool worked great. Okay, so I got the fork flipped over in the vise now. You're gonna pull out that push rod, slide the spring guide onto the push rod. The skinny side goes down, and then you've got your little lock nut here that you slide on. And then you tighten down that nut just so it contacts the spring guide. You don't want to crank down on this. On some models, you'll also have a spring collar, so just double check your manual to make sure. Then you go ahead and install the rebound rod back into the damping rod. So next up, what we're gonna do is fill the fork up with oil, and using a dirt bike stand with a hole in the center with a couple rags around it so it doesn't scratch the fork works great. So the reason why I got the fork in this stand setup is because the upper tube needs to be completely bottomed out against the bottom tube. So go ahead and fill the fork all the way to the top with the Maxima 5-weight oil. So there are 2 holes on the inner tube that you never want to have the oil level drop lower than, which are about like right here on the fork. Okay, so what we'll do is just grab onto the piston rod, pull it up, and the oil level will drop rapidly. Push it back down, fill it back up to the top, and do that same thing. You'll hear the air bubbles pop out. And at the end there, the rod quickly just jerked up on me. That means there was a lot of air that just purged out of there. You know you're going to be done bleeding the inner tube when the inner push rod here pulls out of the fork with complete tension. It doesn't just jerk out. You want one fluid motion in and out. You'll also notice there won't be any more air bubbles when you pull that rod out and push it back down. So once you've got the inner tube bled, there's actually oil transfer from the inner tube to the outer tube. So what you'll do is actually purge the oil out of the outer tube as well. You'll extend the bottom tube. You only want to extend it about 8 to 10 inches here. You can go too far and extend the tube all the way, but do that about 4 or 5 times and the air should be bled out of the outside of that fork. So next up is setting the oil level. I've got the fork back in the stand here, and I've got this Tusk oil level setter here. There are a bunch of numbers here on the rod in millimeters. Standard level for the 99 KX250 is 108 to 112. Again, check your manual for the setting here. So what I'll do is just adjust the dial to about that 110 mark, which is right here, and screw that screw down. Then insert the fork oil leveling tool onto the top of the fork. And then kind of with 2 hands here, you're gonna suck the oil out of that fork. I had a lot of oil in there, so actually since it's clean oil, you can just dump it right back into your Maxima bottle. Then you just continue to suck the oil out until no oil gets sucked through the tool. There you go, and the oil level is set. Now you can also get this job done with like a piece of cardboard. You can measure the distance that the fork oil level needs to be, stick it down in the fork, and if you see, this is actually 110 millimeters, so it just barely touched the tip of that cardboard. So the fork oil is set perfectly with the tool. I've also seen it done with zip ties as well. But if the fork oil, if you stick the cardboard in or zip tie and the oil level comes up to here, you obviously need to dump some oil out. Or if you stick the cardboard in and it doesn't touch the oil, then you need to add a little bit oil in. So it's just more of a manual process, but the fork oil level tool from Tusk definitely gets the job done great. But in terms of fork oil level, the more oil you have in your fork or the lower the fork oil level, it means there's less air in the fork, more oil. You're gonna have more of a compression, a stiffer compression type feel, like a stiffer spring. If you have less oil, more air, it's kind of acts as like a lighter spring. You're gonna get a little bit of softer compression. So based on your feel and desire, you can adjust the fork oil level accordingly. So next up, we're actually gonna get the fork cap ready, which you wanna make sure, again, before you took it apart, the rebound adjuster should have been clicked all the way out. So if it's not, make sure you do that right now. Then with a little oil, we're gonna oil up that O-ring. It may just be easier to oil up that O-ring when you put it on as well. And then we're just gonna put that to the side. So next we're going to install the spring, and it actually has different ends. If you look at the top, this is called the closed end of the spring, where the coils are much closer together compared to the bottom where they're farther apart. So you want to make sure the closed end faces up. So you actually need to pull up on the push rod in there a little bit. And then you're going to slide the spring over the push rod, and that should kind of just hang out there for a little bit for you. It shouldn't drop down. But you do want to pull up on the push rod and pull it all the way up. And then once that push rod's pulled all the way up, you can kind of put your thumb to make sure the push rod doesn't fall down. Grab your spring collar and then put that on the spring. And then you can go ahead and take your fork cap and screw that onto the push rod. Then pull the spring down, insert the 19 mil wrench onto that lock nut, and you'll tighten down the fork cap against that lock nut to 21 foot-pounds. Then make sure that spring collar is sitting there flush against the spring and let it go back up against the cap. Then you can pull your fork tube up, screw that cap on, And then when you actually go to install the fork on the bike, you'll torque the cap down to 22 foot-pounds. Then once you're done with that, make sure you just push up and down on the fork, make sure it operates smoothly, nothing's binding up. But that's gonna be a wrap on this KYB open chamber fork rebuild video, guys. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them in the comments below. I'll make sure I get to answer them. And if you need any of the tools or products that we used in today's video, if and only if you found value in what I showed you today, if you shop through my Rocky Mountain ATV link in my description below, you support the channel for absolutely no cost, free on your end. So I appreciate when you guys do that. And if you're also not familiar, this is part of my 1999 KX250 split fire build series over on my channel. But that's gonna be a wrap on this video, guys. As always, ride hard, be safe, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace.